I'm Matt Lewis here with Washington Monthly's Bill Scher. We do a show called the DMZ. Bill, how's it going?
It's going fine. It's great to be with you on this illustrious Substack platform.
Indeed. We're still new at this. This is our second time doing this together. Hopefully there won't be too many bugs. And we'll repurpose it, for YouTube and the audio podcast and all that. But I'm liking this so far. I'm enjoying this, and it's always good to see you, Bill Scher.
Are you having a fine time surviving? We're nearing 100 days of Trump, I believe. I don't know if we've quite hit 100, but we're close.
We're nearing it. I tell you what, man, it is amazing how quick things have I don't want to say crumbled, but things have turned. I mean, his approval ratings are way down, poll numbers are down. It's almost like he was trying to squander this opportunity. And I have to tell you, if you're worried about Trump being an authoritarian, I think the saving grace may be the ineptness and the incompetence.
I mean, that's what got us through the first time around. If you didn't die from COVID, I never would have thought we'd return to this. I would have thought everyone would have remembered the incompetence the first time around. But people talk about Trump being a great communicator and a great salesman, a great propagandist, and I think that is proven true when he is not in office. When he is not in office, he is very good at memory holding the past and casting blame on those currently in charge, because he never concedes a point. But when he's in office, both in term one and term two, all his deflection strategies don't work, and we're seeing that in spades right now.
Yes. I have to say, I just did a frustrating podcast yesterday with Megan McArdle. Frustrating because we did a lot of relitigating the past, and she sort of explained to me why voters in 2024 voted for Trump and why they had this, I think, flawed but nostalgia for his first term and the economy. And of course, as you know, Bill, they did not factor in COVID at all as part of his presidency, which I think is a mistake. But I think that I'm not that surprised by anything that's happening. I really feel like this is what he promised, this is what he campaigned on, and this is kind of who he is. But apparently, I think a lot of voters are having buyer's remorse right now.
I mean, that's clearly the case. And I can't say I'm surprised by anything in particular. I mean, I think I did a radio show, in the interim period where I said, I don't think they're going to do a whole lot legislatively. It's going to be all executive orders and trying to push the envelope on how far they can go with the courts. They're going to shoot first and ask questions later, which is what we have seen. I don't know if you just read the interview that Trump gave to Time Magazine. The transcript just went up this morning. And he says in it that he is going to follow the Supreme Court. And of course, he gets squirrely when he talks about the Garcia case in El Salvador.
Right.
Well, the lawyer said we are following that order.
Yeah.
So I don't want to suggest that we're totally out of the constitutional crisis woods, but I did think it is notable that when the Supreme Court said, don't take anyone else out of Texas and send them to El Salvador, that was over the weekend. We're about a week after, and they haven't.
Yeah.
So as much as they have, bent the rules and applied the stress test to the Constitution, and are causing all sorts of uncertainty and chaos, that line is holding. And that bodes well just for the durability of the Constitution of the Republic.
I just listened to a podcast with Tim Miller interviewing Jonathan Rauch. And I want to get Rauch back on my podcast to delve even deeper into this idea, but Roush was basically saying that Trump has these authoritarian tendencies, but he doesn't have like the discipline and competence of, say, the Nazis. He's more in the vein of this kind of family, you know, outfit, like a mafia type regime, and that is why a lot of these. And Roush, it was interesting. Roush goes back and talks about how, like, the beginning of the nation state ended a lot of these. I forget the term of art for this kind of government, but once the world becomes super complex, you need bureaucracies and you need rules that are applied pretty consistently. And so this sort of, slapdash, ham-fisted, like changing our mind all the time just doesn't work if you want to compete in a global world. So anyway, I think, again, just to reiterate, the saving grace may be that even though Trump does seem to have an authoritarian check, he's checking all the boxes of how to be an authoritarian. Some of the execution is very incompetent. And
this is not my area of expertise. I'm not a student of other authoritarian governments, so I cannot speak to you knowledgeably about comparing levels of competency. I would be curious to know if is it really true that other authoritarians are markedly more competent than this one, than this attempted one from Donald Trump? Or is it that America has institutions? America has a constitution that guards against an authoritarian taking things too far. We have a diffuse set of checks and balances that diffuses power. We have a robust media infrastructure, weakened that it may be. It's not at its strongest, but it's still a hell of a lot better than a lot of other places. And then you layer on top of that, you have a highly interconnected global economy.
Yeah.
So one thing that Trump very much wants to do is to turn the clock back to the 19th century, build up a lot of economic walls, and try to keep, American dollars, in America, and force foreign governments, foreign companies to pay us. Of course, those costs get passed down to consumers, and that's just a lot harder to do without massive disruption when you've built up an interconnected global economy. You can't dictate the American economy the way past presidents. Like there was jawboning that JFK did with U.S. Steel because they were worried about inflation, and if U.S. Steel's labor costs went up, that was going to have a huge impact on the American economy. The economy is so much more complicated right now. Jawboning one company wouldn't accomplish that for you. So he's just not in a great position to exert his will in a way that would be smooth and beneficial to the average American.
I also think in the long run, certainly freedom works. Now, there may be a case in the short term that a dictator can get things done quickly because they don't have the bureaucracy to contend with, right? But I think in the long run, we hear stories, from the Soviet Union, how people were afraid, people are afraid to tell the leader of the country the truth. So they lie to him because they don't want to get killed, but for telling the truth. I think that, authoritarianism stifles creativity and all of that. So I do think that in the short run, there may be, you can make the trains run on time, but in the long run, and this applies to whether you're, caring about a country and their prosperity, or whether you're actually just trying to take over. When you're doing everything unilaterally and people are operating by fear and secrecy, eventually it tends to collapse. Bill, let's enough about that. I want to talk about some of your recent writings at the Washington Monthly. But before I do, are you okay on the dog front, or do you need to go?
Yeah, I'm trying to text my wife to bring the dog upstairs. Here, you riff just for a second. I'm just going to
Okay.
let the dog go upstairs and bug someone else.
All right, I'll riff. Let me just thank you all for joining us. I can see some comments here. I should have someone else helping me navigate, but if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them in there. If I can see them and address them, we certainly will. And you're back.
I think dog problems are solved. Apologies
That was
to
quick.
this is the thrills of live substacking.
All right, so I want to start with your latest column, which I have to warn people. I think the headline could sound boring, but this is actually a very interesting conversation. You with your clickbait headlines, Bill. But I think it's a super interesting point that we're going to make here. The title is "Budget Reconciliation Could Be Beginning of the End for the Republican Party," and that budget reconciliation makes people's eyes glaze over. And then when you say it could be the beginning of the end, now it sounds hyperbolic. But I think there's a super interesting point and valid point you're making here. But why don't you go ahead and just tell us what the column's about?
I thought this was a sensationalist headline. I didn't think it was a boring headline.
Well, part of it is.
Well, that's what's interesting about the headline. You start with the boring thing and you end on the sensationalist point.
Yeah.
So it's been under the radar, but the Republicans, they want to pass a reconciliation bill, which is the one way to circumvent the filibuster. You can do it on a party line vote, simple majority vote, but what's in the bill has to be related to the budget. And this is how Trump passed tax cuts in 2017. It's how Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a heavy on climate investments in 2022. Also, George Bush did his tax cuts in his first term. So Trump very much wants another round of tax cuts to offset the costs of the tariffs. He keeps promising that we're all going to make bank with this plan. It doesn't work at all without passing tax cuts. And even then, it's probably not going to fully offset. I mean, it depends how, what tariffs stay in place and how much money they actually bring in. But Trump runs a risk of not fully offsetting the cost here. And mind you, a lot of the cost of the tax cuts in this bill are going to be extending the 2017 tax cuts, which is not a new tax cut for you and me, but it is new as far as the budget is concerned. So you look back at the Bush tax cuts from his first term, and there were certain people that said, hey, this is going to bust the budget. This is going to widen our deficits. And Dick Cheney famously said to the Treasury Secretary, Reagan proved deficits don't matter. Once you stop worrying about balancing the budget, doing what comes naturally for Republicans, cutting taxes, is a whole lot easier. And tax cuts have really been the thing that defined the Republican Party more than anything else over the last 40 plus years. Republicans have gone down all sorts of weird paths with Donald Trump since 2016, places that they would not have normally gone, like cozying up with Russia, using government power to penalize enemies, tariffs. All these things are not comfortable for a lot of old school Republicans, but tax cuts, that's fundamental. So at the same time, you have an increased emphasis on balancing the budget this time around. This is really driven by the Freedom Caucus types, who are kind of sick and tired of being told they're going to cut spending and balance the budget, and it never really happens. We don't want to do the shell games that happened with Reagan and Bush. We don't want to cut taxes and not cut the spending and have the deficit get bigger. We don't want to raise the debt ceiling if you're going to do that again. So they're trying harder to make the numbers, quote unquote, add up. And then you have Steve Bannon And to some extent, J.D. Vance. I mean,
Yeah.
Steve Bannon, you can say, well,
Yeah.
he's just some
And,
guy on the
and,
podcast.
and let me just put a pin in it real quick, because I think what we're
Yeah.
seeing is this: what happens when you have an unwieldy coalition where very disparate, they're not all singing off the same hymn sheet. They're in some cases mutually exclusive ideas within this Republican Party, and they've gotten away with it so far. And I think what you're saying now, and I want you to keep telling the story about J.D. Vance and Steve Bannon, but that maybe we're getting to a point where it becomes untenable, right?
Well, so you can go back to January, at least, where Steve Bannon openly talked about raising taxes on the wealthy to make this add up. We really got to cut spending, and Bannon said we really got to cut into defense. We don't want to get into Medicaid and Social Security. We got to shrink government, cut defense, and if we're going to balance the budget, we got to get wealthy people to pay more. And he even said to Ross Duth at the New York Times, I don't want to just soak the rich. Well, maybe I do, but that's not. I mean, I'm not being totally verbatim, but that's not what we base the policy on. The numbers just have to add up. And so this might have seemed like Bannon being idiosyncratic, but in the past week, we had news coverage saying this was being seriously discussed inside the White House, and that J.D. Vance in particular was expressing openness to it. And you got a handful of Freedom Caucus guys like Chip Roy and Andy Harris that went on record saying they'd be open to this too. So it got a little more real. And the Wall Street Journal editorial board freaked out. And then Mike Johnson said, we're not doing that. We want to prevent the largest tax increase in history. That's Mike Johnson's words.
Mm-hmm.
And what could he mean by that? He means the tariffs.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about that, because I remember hearing Mike Johnson say that, and I didn't know what he meant. I thought maybe he meant that allowing the Trump tax cuts to expire or something. But what makes you?
That's a fair interpretation too. So I credit you for that. But I think both are applicable here.
Well, and you and I have had this discussion before, but the tariffs, in effect, are essentially a sales tax on American consumers. And if Democrats could label the tariffs as a tax and get the American public to understand that that's precisely what they are, not only would it be bad politics, but it would really undermine the Republican brand that Grover Norquist, the famous tax champion, always talks about, that once that brand is gone, you can't get it back.
Well, right. I mean, this in Robert Novak had said, and I quoted him in the piece, although I'm not going to use the right words. God put the Republican Party on this earth to cut taxes. If they don't do that, they serve no useful function. I mean, I think that is how central tax cutting is to the Republican Party. And now you have apparently J.D. Vance, who's not just a sitting vice president, but someone who would at least have a shot at being the nominee in 2028, and he's very young, would presumably be playing some sort of role in shaping the post-Trump party, saying, maybe we can raise taxes on the wealthy. And he's someone who's been on record before saying that we shouldn't further cut the corporate tax rate, that we should consider closing loopholes so corporations pay more. Like, he's been in this space previously. And now Trump came in Wednesday and threw cold water on all this. Said, we don't want millionaires to flee the country, which is not really something that would be a concern, because unless they renounce their citizenship, they'd still have to pay taxes on their money. And he also said separately in this Time magazine interview, well, it's bad politics. Which of course is the total converse. Like, the polls show people love taxing millionaires as long as they don't get taxed. But he's reminding us of the George H.W. Bush, read my lips, reversal. So he's making these kind of convoluted arguments.
By the way, I always felt Bush got a raw deal on that one, because when people say raising taxes, they always think income taxes, right? But that's not what George H.W. Bush raised when
there's a gas tax increase as well. There are fee type things in there. So Trump put the kibosh on this, it would seem. And so you could look at that and say, well, problem solved, Republican brand intact. This is a little bit of a dust up, and it's over now. But what I'm suggesting here, you have two issues. One, this hasn't solved the budget reconciliation bill issue. They are nowhere on finding consensus on that. You still have this emphasis on balancing the budget, or at least taking large steps towards that, and they can't square that circle. Bannon on his podcast said Wednesday, these numbers still don't add up if they don't do this. And you have House Republicans talking about deep cuts in Medicaid, but House moderates saying, I'm not so sure we're going to go along with that, and the Senate folks not being on board. So if you don't do that, where's the money coming from? And so one, they're running the risk of not passing this bill at all.
Yeah,
because they can't make it add up.
And let me just say, right? Okay, so Trump has done very little legislatively. Republicans have done very little legislatively. Most of what we're seeing happen, as you noted, you predicted this early on: executive orders, administrative stuff, not actual legislation. Republicans have a very slim majority in the House. What is it? Who knows? There's retirements and deaths, but something like three seats or something like that. Yeah. And you've got these unwieldy coalitions who disagree fundamentally on some pretty big issues, but Republicans do have the opportunity, right? You can only do, is it maybe like once every fiscal year you're allowed to do budget reconciliation bills, which are, unlike everything else, it's filibuster proof. It's just a pure majority. What am I missing, Bill?
Well, you're not missing anything. I mean, what happened in 2017 was they took a shot at budget reconciliation to repeal Obamacare. They failed. It did not happen. And then they said, okay, well, let's get back to tax cuts. We're good at doing tax cuts. Let's do a bill on that, and they pulled that off. So I mean, if they fail this time around, you get another bite at the apple. Joe Biden failed on the Build Back Better reconciliation, and they recovered with a smaller but still significant Inflation Reduction Act. So there's time on the clock, but if they're going to be adamant about balancing the budget or taking large strides towards balancing the budget, they're making their job very difficult. If that wasn't a concern, it was just tax cuts for the fun of tax cuts, it would be a lot easier.
And also, I mean, presumably this infighting could lead to more trouble down the road, where you could actually have people attacking, the Steve Bannon wing against the Freedom Caucus wing, and who knows, Chip Roy or whatever. This could open up the potential for some bad blood, as Taylor Swift may say.
I think if the bill outright fails, then gloves will come off, fingers will be pointed, factions will run into their corners, and that would be very ugly for Republicans.
And Trump would presumably pick a team or pick a side, right? And that would probably nudge enough people, but still, it's not a great way to run a railroad.
Well, yeah, the safer bet is that Trump does come in and say, "Hey, you babies, stop squabbling and just do this thing. It's not going to be perfect, but we can't fail to pass tax cuts. We can't allow a snapback to the 2016 rates. They're going to screw, all of our people." So I would not put money on outright failure here. They'll probably find a way to do something, and people will grind their teeth about it, but they'll do something. But even in that scenario, I think the toxin has been injected into the bloodstream. You've already had J.D. Vance publicly reported as being open to tax increases on the wealthy. Now this becomes something that can well be a point of dissension in the future. So it wouldn't necessarily detonate this year, but it would potentially be a source of division come 2028. And again, it's not just on any old issue. All parties have disagreements. There's always a challenge to build coalitions with people who have disparate interests. But when I look at what holds the Republican Party today and in the past decade, roughly speaking, it's trust that Trump knows how to run the economy, culture war, fear mongering, and commitment to tax cuts. Now, when it comes to trust in Trump's handling of the economy, that's now been undermined very quickly in the past couple months, as is devotion to tax cuts, because already tariffs are a tax increase. That's already smeared, that's already besmirched the Republican brand. So you're only adding on top of this notion that maybe we jack up taxes on the wealthy too. Your tariffs are a regressive tax that the wealthy don't care as much about. They might care about in terms of the bottom of their companies, but in terms of their individual, income taxes, it's not that big of a hit. So if those pillars are deteriorating, all you got left is the culture war, fear mongering. I don't think that's enough to sustain a party. I think at that point, never Trumpers didn't destroy the Republican Party because, again, Trump did well enough in the economy, COVID year aside, delivered on the tax cuts, got the Supreme Court judges to help with the culture war, fear mongering. So, he delivered on the main things, and never Trumpers seem kind of small and petty.
But
if you're failing on the other things, different story.
Let this never Trumper praise the Supreme Court, which has been, I think, pretty good at pushing back on Donald Trump's authoritarian grabs. A couple quick notes before we move on, Bill. First, I want to welcome everyone to our Substack Live. We love doing it here. I especially welcome the ladies. If you notice, Bill, I don't know if you can see, we're getting it. I don't know if it's because we're eye candy or if it's Substack. But for whatever reason, ladies are joining us. We welcome you. We welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. And Bill, here's another plug. You mentioned the culture wars. I don't know if you saw this. I wrote a piece. Hi, Angie. I wrote a piece over at. And by the way, if you're watching this on YouTube or whatever retroactively, why don't you sign up for our Substacks and participate in real time? Bill, I wrote at my Substack about, I don't know if you saw this. It happened on Monday. I kind of missed it until I was a couple days late to it. But Congressman, I think it's Maxwell Frost from Texas, went on Will
Frost is
Florida, my apologies. Will Kane's Fox News show. Now, I like Will Kane. I was actually on his radio show promoting my book, Filthy Rich Politicians in 2023. Super nice guy to me. But this exchange was wild. And basically, what happened is Congressman Frost they were talking about, disappearing Abrego Garcia. And Congressman Frost referenced the fact that Donald Trump may next turn his sights on U.S. citizens, which Will Kane was just astonished by and pushed back and where are you getting this? What's your documentation? And then the congressman was like, well, he said he wanted to go with homegrowns next. And he said that in the Oval Office on TV, to the El Salvador dictator. And the point that I wrote in my Substack essay was about, this really shows you kind of the echo chambers and the epistemic closure, where I literally think millions of people who watch Fox News, who are not dumb people, who are actually watching news, have no idea that Trump said he wants to go for homegrowns next. And if they don't know that, what else do you and I know, and all of our viewers here, that these Fox News viewers, have no idea is happening?
Trump just talked about this quite openly in the Time magazine interview. I mean, he put some caveats on it, saying you'd only do this if it was, under the law, but he would want to. So he's not hiding the ball, but I do think Fox News is sanding down what they're putting into their news funnel.
All right. Well, let's move on. You talked a lot about J.D. Vance being willing to raise taxes on the wealthy, which is, I think, a pretty popular position, but certainly a departure from Republican orthodoxy. But J.D. Vance wants to do something else. He wants us to have more babies. And you have a piece over at Washington Monthly titled, "Menstrual Classes plus Mass Deportations Equals Peak stupidity.
Mhm.
Tell us about that, Bill Scher.
Well, before I get into, so I just want to ask you, where are you on the pro-natalist movement? I just want to know,
Oh,
where you stand.
I would like tax incentives to have more sex, but babies could probably will be an externality of that. No, in all seriousness, I am pro-natalist, but I'm also pro-immigration, and I know that's where you're going with this. I'm up
Right.
with people, Bill. I like.
Put the immigration thing aside, like, do you want to see government programs, government money to support more baby making?
Look, I'll say this: the devil's in the details. I'm sure there are proposals that I wouldn't like. Some people, no, I know. Look, there are libertarians or whatever who would call this social engineering, to which I think plead guilt. We plead guilty on that. But I'm sure there are things about this that are weird and that I wouldn't support. But in general, I think it's healthy for people to, for a nation to be prosperous and fruitful. And if government policies can nudge that along, and rather than, I don't look at it as encouraging having more kids as much as welcoming them and supporting parents. You and I both are dads. We both have kids. I just saw Steve Ratner on Morning Joe this morning had this chart of why people don't have kids. I like this one. 20% of respondents said, I don't like kids. And I totally understand that as a dad. I love
Which
them,
is
but
which
sometimes we
is
don't like.
why, from a traditional conservative perspective, you would be very skeptical about the notion that you could create a government program
Yeah.
that's going to convince somebody to make a lifelong commitment to parenthood because there was a government program, or they gave them a little extra
Yeah.
money, or
And would we want that? Would we want people who hate kids to do it for the money? I don't think so. But
I mean,
Steve Ratner
if you
also,
hate kids, you just wouldn't do it. Like, there
well,
wouldn't
you
be
shouldn't.
right.
You're right, though. These things tend not to work when they're done under the guise of trying to incentivize childbirth. It tends not to work. Having said that, Steve Ratner, back to his chart, the number one, I think it was the number one reason, don't quote me on that, but a prime reason people aren't having kids is the sense that it costs too much. That to me is a bad thing. Well, if we can alleviate that through policies, then I'm all for that. And again, the devil's in the details.
We currently have child tax credits for that
Yeah,
reason. Joe Biden tried to really jack that up very high and couldn't get that extended over a year. It's like, I think there are things I would be comfortable with. I think most people are comfortable with, to say we don't want to have barriers for people who want to have kids. Let's see if we can alleviate those barriers. But of course, you can take things too far, and you can just have ideas that just aren't practical. It just won't work. Uh, but to get back to what I wrote about, there is an argument for being pronatalist that is rooted in some legitimate policy concerns. We have America, like a lot of developed nations, has a low birth rate, a birth rate lower than replacement rate, and that makes it hard to sustain retirement programs like Social Security and Medicare. You need a base of workers to contribute money to help cover the cost of the existing retiree population, and so that can continue, cyclically as people age. So, legitimate thing to be worried about.
yeah. Well, also, I would say, Matt Iglesias, I didn't read his book, A Million Americans, but Um, I think just from a national security standpoint and from an economic standpoint, more people, more ideas, more just whatever. There's a billion Chinese. That means that like the lowest 1% of Chinese students who go into engineering outnumber us, all of our, engineers or whatever. I mean, you do the math. More people, just more opportunities. And this is another reason not to derail us why I think what Trump is doing with our allies is stupid. If you add up the free world, we basically match China. If America goes it alone, we're like a quarter or a third or something of China. So to the point that numbers matter in a technological world, and I still think they do. This is not a bad policy for a nation to pursue.
Um, but if your if you have a legitimate interest in maintaining
Oh, by
population
the way,
level.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Bill. I think I
Sure.
said Matt Iglesias wants 1 million Americans.
Uh, or you need a
Right?
billion, right?
It's 1 billion. My
All right.
apologies.
That's all right. Um, if your concern is maintaining population levels, you wouldn't care about where the people came from, whether they came through births or they came from immigration. And the fact is, we've had higher immigration rates in recent years that have helped us maintain population. And yet, the current administration is trying to throw those people out. So they're making the job harder to maintain population levels. So they've already started the process of mass deportations, and now they're tossing around ideas for encouraging baby making, which are of dubious effectiveness, let alone whether they are even around the merits or not. Would probably be unlikely to offset the loss of people you get from throwing them out and sending them to El Salvadorian prisons. And so, if you want more people, but you don't want those people, what
Yeah.
is really what's driving you here?
Right.
And and then you layer on top of that, the New York Times just did an article about the pro-natalist movement. There was a big conference, and they mentioned that a lot of folks who have some legitimate interest in maintaining population levels are unnerved that the movement has ties to white supremacists and to misogynists who are pushing women should only have these traditional roles. They shouldn't be in the workplace. They shouldn't be in the military. And so that cast a pall over the whole project.
Yeah.
So when you have the White House considering, let's have government programs that educate people on their menstrual cycles so they can use their natural fertility to improve their baby making. And while we do that, let's toss out 2 million immigrants. You got to wonder, if one, would this even work? And what's the real motivation here?
Right. So one of our commenters said that in Norway they have a monthly stipend that is based on how many children you have. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's a possible
Well,
idea.
one idea that was tossed around, according to the New York Times, was a $5,000 baby bonus for having a kid. Like that might get you through, a year's worth of diapers or something. Like it's not the cost of having a kid over an 18, 21-year period is enormous.
They have no idea. Yeah.
And look, Biden did an expanded child tax credit, which was proven to have slashed child poverty instantaneously. I mean, it stands to reason. I'm just giving you a bunch of money, you will be less poor. The problem with it was it's very expensive, and so he couldn't get Joe Manchin to stick with it and put it in another reconciliation bill. And the Republicans weren't on board with it, and so the thing died. But if you really want to encourage larger families, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And that's not saying the Republicans who are again obsessed about balancing the budget. And look, balancing the budget is a perfectly legitimate goal. At the state and local level, like you legally have to balance your budgets. Federal government is in a different place because it can print its own money. It can sustain deficits for a longer period of time. Less important. But if you're going to be obsessed about that, and you also want to have all this government balancing the budget, money to encourage baby making, throwing immigrants out, like none of these pieces fit. This gets to basic competence. You're governing on impulse and irrational hatreds, not on effective governments.
Yeah, look, I think when you are tightening immigration, not just illegal immigration, but pretty much you don't like immigrants, you're trying to cause people to self-deport, and then you're complaining about not having enough people. There's a lot of tension there. There's some contradiction there. And so I think it's perfectly fair to wonder, like, is the goal just more white babies? And is that really what they're after? And I think it's no doubt that at least some of the people who are part of this coalition this pro-natalist coalition. Some of them have that motive, that sort of sinister. Well, I'm all for white babies too, but not exclusively. You get my point. Some of them have that ulterior motive, cloaked behind this, I think, much more defensible pro-natalist position, which I am pro-natalist. But look, Bill, I'm also pro-immigrant, and Ronald Reagan. I mean, you got the bingo card. You knew he was going to come up eventually. Well, I think you already invoked Ronaldus Magnus earlier. But Reagan talked about the importance of immigrants and how not only should we be a beacon of hope where we welcome people who are fleeing oppression, but that they renew us, that they keep us young, and that they bring ideas and youth and rejuvenation to us, and that they are assimilated. And if you don't think they're assimilated, well, go ask all those Hispanics who voted for Donald Trump.
Well, that's
They
the part
do.
about this. That's the part that I do find strange here, because Trump, counterintuitively, has diversified the Republican Party to some degree, and if that's sustained, I would think some of these obsessions with DEI programs and hatred of immigrants would fall by the wayside. I mean, they've gone away with it so far because you can find people who are not white, who are probably largely people who have been in America for generations, who have adopted nativist positions. There's someone quoted, the Washington Post had a poll showing that Trump's now underwater on immigration in terms of approval of his handling of immigration. But they found one guy in Oklahoma who they said was African American and Native American who was repeating, Trump talking points on immigrants. Like those individuals exist. Yeah. Ethnic groups are not monoliths, and so Trump has found the people who are mad about
this makes sense. What Trump's strategy? No, it doesn't make sense logically or ethically or morally, but it makes sense strategically because I interviewed Mike Madrid on the podcast a couple months ago, and he pointed out to me that it's the second or third, mainly third generation Hispanics who were the biggest Trump supporters, and so trying to stop immigration today does stop likely now if they become citizens, if they get registered to vote, a lot of big caveats, but presumably trying to stop immigration today would probably limit the number of Democratic voters who would be voting against Republicans in the short term, while simultaneously not bothering those third generation Hispanics who don't see themselves primarily through a racial identity, but rather through a class consciousness. They view themselves as a working class, basically white folk in terms of how their political identities are formed. And so there's really not much of a cost for Trump and being anti-immigrant.
Well, I think the potential long-term cost is the degree to which he's taking these positions. He's lost support immigration because he's gone to the mat on letting Kilmar Garcia rot in an El Salvador prison when there is an admission that he was wrongly deported. I mean, he literally has a judicial order saying you cannot deport this person to El Salvador. Yes, you could deport him somewhere else, but not. He's legally allowed to work here, and you can't deport him to El Salvador. Those are the two things, and they violated that. They admitted violating it, and they're saying, "Well, nothing we can do here." Like taking that position is not essential to saying, you know what, immigrants with criminal records shouldn't be here. They could have been far more.
We started this conversation, Bill. I think we've gone full circle because we started this conversation with this, question that I've been really exploring. You and I have been exploring probably for a long time, which is on one hand, Donald Trump seems to be executing this very strategic plan. On the other hand, there's a lot of chaos and incompetence. And how do you square these two things? He's got this authoritarian checklist. He's going through it pretty systematically. On the other hand, they're doing stupid things that are costing them opportunities to roll up power. And how do you square those? And I think the missing ingredient here is ideology. Okay, ideology can blind people and force them to do stupid things. And when it comes to the way they're treating immigrants and tariffs, these are maybe the only two things that are Trump's true ideology. And I would say when it comes to the way that they're treating immigrants, it's Stephen Miller is definitely the evil, genius behind that. And so I don't think it makes sense uh, from a political standpoint to be as aggressive as they've been. But I think Stephen Miller does believe that this is a calling. This is his purpose in life. And I think Trump just intuitively uh, is anti-immigrant, and that explains why their ideology is overriding what I think would be the politically smart position. You could have done this much more. You could have done this same thing in a much more uh, compassionate, ironic, whatever the word is, way, and accomplished the same goal. But here's what they want to do. The cruelty is the point, right? They want to scare people, both immigrants who will self-deport or not come here, and political opponents and adversaries, us homegrowns, Bill.
I mean, I would take the point you made just one step farther. It's not simply ideology that's making them stupid; it's bigotry. I think bigotry,
That is their
rots.
ideology.
It is. I think bigotry really rots the mind. And if they were being more politically clinical about it, they'd say, you know what, being kind of anti-establishment, anti-political correctness, talking in this kind of rough, unvarnished way, even to some extent being, anti-expert when it comes to the pandemic. That has a certain appeal that's transcending class and racial lines. It's helping us diversify this coalition. Uh, I don't need to adopt every position from white supremacist chat boards to maintain this coalition. You only do it if you really want to, and they really want to. They want to deport immigrants on a mass scale, to the extent that they don't want to have due process be the law in doing so. I mean, to acknowledge the mistake with Garcia is to acknowledge that due process is necessary to avoid such mistakes, and they don't want that. And so that's leading them to places that are politically dangerous for the Republican Party going forward. Not dangerous to Donald Trump personally, because he's not going to be on the ballot again. But for everyone else who's got to be on the ballot, it's a problem.
How you doing on time, Bill? I got two topics. We could pick one to end on, or we could bounce now and just save it for next week. What do you want to do?
We can do one more.
Okay. Let me give you the two topics, and you tell me which one you like. One is the Pete Hegseth signal scandal. It does seem like the walls may be closing in on him, but who knows? The other one is the Democrats, and I have a piece coming out in the LA Times on Monday about this. But I wanted to ask you about David Hogg. He's the
let's do that. Let's.
You want to do that? Okay, so he's a Parkland survivor activist. He just became deputy chair or something or other for the DNC, and he is more aggressive than than others. He wants to basically use his PAC, not the party specifically, but his PAC, to target older, moderate, incumbent Democrats, spend something like $20 or $30 million or something like that, to sort of bring in a younger, more combative, more progressive, dark woke, I don't know, generation of Democratic leaders. Some people think this is utterly stupid. Why would you spend millions of dollars targeting your own team in a cycle when you're pretty much guaranteed to take the House? Others may argue, Bill, the Democrats have a real problem, and they have a very low approval rating, 27%, according to at least one survey. And you got to shake things up, and we need an infusion of young blood, new blood. Where do you come down on this?
Well, number one, it's wildly inappropriate for someone who is in the DNC to be spearheading a program that's going to attack on the Democrats. If that's what you want to do with your day, that's fine. Don't be in the DNC. DNC's job is to help existing Democrats, not to foster intra-party warfare. So I think he's got to choose. As far as do Democrats need this kind of program, people are just a little impatient. Dick Durbin just resigned. He's 80 years old. Old people will leave. They will eventually leave.
I'm not sure they will. Most of them don't.
I know there are extreme examples, of course. We know about Ginsburg. We know about Biden. We know about Feinstein. I know. But look, Hakeem Jeffries is the minority leader now, not Nancy Pelosi, even though she's still in Congress. And people want to rush Pelosi out sooner than she should have. Pelosi should have been there as long as she was. She was good at her job, and you needed someone with expertise to deal with Donald Trump and not a rookie. So it's hard to apply these things on a rigid basis just on a number itself. But on the whole, people will retire naturally. And I think you're starting to see that now. And you just you don't need to cause more problems and divert resources and cause introvert dissension when you really want to focus on uniting the party and make sure Republicans have their divisions right now. You want a dynamic where Dems are united, Republicans are divided. That's how you win elections. And if you're not forcing the issue on the Democratic side, you're more likely to maintain that dynamic. You can win a midterm with people who are over 80 years old. You don't need to shove people out the door to win those kinds of races. We saw Jan Schakowsky retired. This is a safe Democratic seat. Schakowsky was not an obstacle to anything. So making a big deal about knocking her out, did you accelerate her retirement by a term or two? I don't know. Who cares? She wasn't the problem.
Look, I also think, and this has been just a recurring theme I keep talking about, is like a political party's brand is not determined by rank and file House members. It's the top of the ticket. That will define your brand identity. And if you want a more youthful, hip, whatever Democrats are longing for, it's going to be determined by who the nominee is. It doesn't really matter.
That's also why obsessing about Chuck Schumer was, well, Chuck Schumer shouldn't be there. He's a leader. He looks old and decrepit, and he didn't fight on the shutdown. We need someone younger. Brian Schatz may be the person who's going to be the next leader. He voted to avert a shutdown too. People can make political judgments that you don't agree with regardless of age. Schumer did not make that decision because he's in his 70s. He made it because he made a judgment that forcing a shutdown was going to make things harder for Democrats and make it more difficult to put pressure on Republicans, which I think has borne out. Republicans are who is in a bad spot in the midterms right now? Republicans, not Democrats. Democrats might have a bad net approval right now, but Republicans are the ones who are really on the ropes. Trump's numbers are plummeting. They lost the Wisconsin Supreme Court race by a lot when Musk stuck his nose in it. And Republicans underperformed in these really ruby red areas in the Florida special election. So as weak as the Democratic brand may be, it's not what's salient in elections when Republicans are the ones in charge. Democrats won elections when Harry Reid was, in a leadership position, and no one really loved his persona and his charisma at the time. Yeah. People might like his fighting nature now, but at the time he was considered very milquetoast. But it didn't matter. Top of the ticket mattered. Nancy Pelosi wasn't the best person to be in your ads, but you wanted her where it counted in the Trump administration. You wanted her where it counted in the Obama administration to get bills passed. So everyone's got their roles. Maybe Schumer doesn't run again next time because he's old. I don't know. I don't care. That's not what 2028 or 26 or 20 is going to be depend on.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, everybody who watched this. If you have not done so already, if you're a follower of mine, please subscribe to Bill Scher on Substack. And Bill, definitely read his stuff at Washington Monthly. I think you can tell by our conversation that it's sagacious and insightful. Bill, anything you want to plug?
Share the WashingtonMonthly.com. Lots of good stuff up there today. In addition to my piece on budget reconciliation, we have a piece from a neighbor of mine, Carrie Baker, on how reproductive freedom advocates have gone around Dobbs through an elaborate network of distribution of abortion pills that anti-abortion advocates have not been able to stop. And so it really gets into the details on these networks that I think is very interesting. So I would check that out at thewashingtonmonthly.com.
Awesome. We're going to post this, so check it out my YouTube channel. Check out my column at The Hill and the LA Times coming up on the Democrats, including David Hogg. Thanks to Angie for the emojis and all the folks who joined us here at Substack. And let us know, should we be doing this at a different time? I like mornings. Bill and I usually do mornings. I'm sure there's more people watching Substack in the night. That seems scary to me. I don't think I should do that, but maybe we will.
We can do DMZ after dark. See how that performs.
But I would have to wear like a cape or a robe and drink like a cosmopolitan or something. It's like I would have to become a totally different type of person. I'm not that kind of guy, Bill. But who knows? Maybe I am. All right. Always a pleasure, Bill Scher. And thanks to everyone. We'll see you back here. Who knows? Maybe next week.
Take care.
See you, Bill.